planted in the garden of life. Is your life an ugly weed or pretty flower? Are you growing straight or blowing wild? Do you have your roots in his kingdom? Or are you still the prince of darkness, child? Weeds, we're all born weeds, full of sinful nature and strife. Weeds, just ugly weeds, planted in the garden of life. You can be a flower if you let the Lord be yours, and you won't be a weed anymore.
Weeds by a dear friend of mine, Gary S. Paxton. Today I'm coming to you with chapter number 4, Elder Charley and the Sunshine Band. I would like to say a few words before I go into this story. I would like to add a note here to say, I hope this doesn't hurt anyone or bring up any hard or bad feelings. The quotes I am using are from the newspaper, television, and memory in general. I wanted to say this was given today in love for family and friends, for those of you that are involved or were involved with any of the situations that I mentioned in this story. Again, Elder Charley and the Sunshine Band. Those piercing eyes stared from the pulpit down on the children's junior choir, just like a mouse hunting for a piece of cheese. The little children sang unto the Lord every Sunday morning and some evenings. The children aged from 5 to 12 years old. Some were tall and large for their ages. One had to be 13 years old to be promoted to the youth choir, and by this time at 12, Annie was taller than anyone in the choir. There she sat on the front row with a tiny two-sided reversible yellow and blue bow-tied cape around her shoulders. Annie looked very much like a carrot in a pea patch. All of her close friends were already in the youth choir, giggling and teasing Annie about her size. She was a proud member of the Sunshine Band. Elder Charley had not been at the church very long. He was a new minister who had come to town from Oklahoma City. He was a tall, big man, well over 6 feet tall, with a massive build like a cowboy. He was married to a lovely lady, and Annie knew quite well that they had not been married very long. They were newlyweds. Annie also knew that he would stare at her until she would feel uncomfortable. One day after service was over, Annie was twirling around the pole of a stop sign next to the church, waiting to go home for her parents to head for the car. Elder Charley, alone, drove up close to the sign, leaned over and rolled down his car window. He said, "Annie, your eyes are so beautiful. I would just love to stare deep into them up close." Smart as a whip, Annie knew he was being inappropriate. He sounded like the teenage boys at school when they were flirting with the older girls. Annie was petrified with terror. Normally quite a chatty girl, she lost all ability to speak at that moment. Something was dreadfully wrong with this man. She didn't trust him. Annie knew instinctively that he would harm her, so she managed to stay away from him at all times. Annie also learned to avoid his sinister gaze, but she could feel his cold-blooded stare on her skin. Annie remembered the true story she had been told when she was 8 years old of a beautiful little girl who had been kidnapped, raped, and killed. Momma Lydia often told her, "Don't talk to strangers or people you don't trust." All of the children living in that vicinity knew the story of Rose Marie Riddle and were admonished by their parents to always be careful when walking to school or outside alone. The news reported the true, sad, and disturbing story. Little Rose Marie was brutally raped and murdered at the hands of Richard Arlen Lindsay and his wife, Dixie, a record by Bill Woods. According to court documents, while driving through Kern County on the afternoon of January 12, 1961, Lindsay told his wife, 7 months pregnant at the time, that he wanted a little girl for sexual purposes. They drove into the Shafter labor camp, and Dixie spoke to some children playing outside, saying that she wanted to hire someone to clean up her house. No doubt money was tight in a labor camp, so one of the kids went into a nearby house and returned with young Rose Marie, who unfortunately got into the car with the Lindsays. After driving a short while, the couple pulled over to swill some whiskey, and Rose Marie began crying, saying she wanted to go home. The heartless Dixie slapped her and remarked to her husband that somebody would likely hear the crying girl, so they might as well go someplace and get it over with. Lindsay turned off the highway and drove a few hundred yards down a dirt road, at which point Dixie removed Rose's panties, got into the back seat, presumably to watch the horrible events unfolding right in front of her. Lindsay, in the somewhat genteel language of the day, assaulted young, defenseless Rose Marie and then choked her. When his wife announced, "I guess she's dead," Lindsay removed the girl from the car and placed her on the ground. A few moments later, Dixie thought she heard the girl moaning, so she announced, "I'll make sure she's dead," and got out of the car and hit little Rose Marie in the head with a tire iron 19 times. 3 days later, they were arrested in Livermore, California, and eventually pled guilty to kidnapping, rape, and murder charges. The trial proceeded with truly breathtaking speed, and Lindsay's death sentence was handed down by the court only 18 days after the murder. Less than 10 months later, the state of California executed Richard Arlen Lindsay in the San Quentin gas chamber on November 14, 1961. As for Lindsay's wife, Dixie, she was given 2 life sentences. Whether she was ever paroled or not is unknown. As mentioned earlier, Dixie was 7 months pregnant at the time of Rose Marie's murder, and she gave birth to a son, later given to her mother to raise on March 22, 1961. For some reason, Elder Charley would always make Annie remember this story. He terrified her on a weekly basis. It was a good thing that the mothers of the church were watchful over the children in those days. Someone was watching Elder Charley as he watched the small children. Annie continued to sing like a lark. She loved to sing and awaited her turn. The choir administrator decided to make Annie sing solos, lead and direct the songs of the smaller kids while she played the piano. People hurt children a lot during those days and still do. During this same time period, one of the little girls, 8-year-old Janine, became another child victim. She often visited with her family and grandmother, who attended one of the local district churches. Janine was kidnapped from her home by a friend of the family. For days, the Sacramento County Police and Sheriff Departments searched nonstop for Janine. The church folk all over the city prayed for the family and for her safe return. Days passed and Janine was not found. All Points bulletins continued to play on the radio and television station in search of Janine. The Sacramento Bee, Fresno Bee, Bakersfield, California, and Observer newspapers posted missing headlines and photos of Janine, adding to the massive hunt for a missing little girl. Bloodhounds were brought in to track the scent of Janine, but the trail ended right in front of the family's house. The trackers were perplexed because the hounds would bark, moan, and howl, running in circles back and forth across the street. Just when the case seemed unsolvable, someone stumbled upon a dead body. The body and clothing was identified as belonging to Janine Abram. She had been found murdered, raped, and left in a field like trash. Annie and the other children were very sad. Janine was a fun, sweet little girl who never hurt anyone. She was a bit chunky and clumsy for her age, but always kept a smile on her face. The songs rang out, Amazing Grace, and Yes, Jesus Loves Me. Standing proudly, draped in their yellow and blue capes, Annie and the Sunshine Band sang bravely at the funeral service of their friend Janine, also a member of her church's Sunshine Band. Reports came back that they had identified Janine's killer. All along, it was someone who had watched her from down the street. Her neighbor had waited for the perfect opportunity to snatch Janine and take her life. He must have stalked her every move. With continued investigation, someone finally remembered seeing Mr. Miller putting Janine into his car. They thought he was giving her a ride somewhere with the family's permission, since he was often seen on the street playing with the neighborhood kids. criminal case number 11998 in bank, June 26, 1969, and I read, The People, Plaintiff and Respondent versus Willie Curtis Miller, Defendant and Appellant. Facts. About 9:30 Saturday morning, August 12, 1967, Defendant Willie Curtis Miller, 40 years of age, called at the home of Mrs. Betty Abram. He was drinking a can of Colt 45 stout malt and carried a paper sack containing 2 additional unopened cans of Colt 45 stout malt. About 30 minutes after his arrival, he told Mrs. Abram that he would go to the grocery store to get some soda pop for her 5 children. Janine Abram, age 8, received her mother's consent to accompany the defendant to the store. In response to Mrs. Abram's inquiry, the defendant said he would bring Janine right back. Janine collected some empty pop bottles, climbed into the front passenger seat of the defendant's 1954 Ford station wagon, and rode away with him about 10 a.m. This was the last time Mrs. Abrams saw Janine alive. She was wearing a red turtleneck sweater, white underpants without rips or holes, and blue Bermuda shorts, slightly split along the side seams at the hemline. Her nude, partially decomposed body was found about 7 a.m. the following Wednesday, face down in the shallow water of Dry Creek, at a point adjacent to the intersection of Elkhorn Boulevard and 10th Street in Sacramento, approximately 4 miles from her home. Her head was under the water, and her heels nearly touching the bank of the creek. The body was in a semi-kneeling position with the legs drawn up. The back and buttocks were out of the water. The arms were in the water, elbows bent. 2 branches approximately 13 feet long with considerable foliage and leafy material had been chopped down and placed in a tree above the body, tending to obscure it from observation by light planes taking off and landing on an adjacent north-south airfield runway. Janine's red sweater was hanging in the branches of a tree approximately 15 feet south of the body. Also hanging on a branch below the sweater were her blue Bermuda shorts, completely torn across the crotch and along the sides of the legs. Submerged in the water under the shorts were her panties, torn at the crotch. On the bank of Dry Creek above the body, there was a matted area of grass, oval in shape, about 6 by 10 feet in area. Within the trampled grass area, an unsmoked Capital's Palmer cigar in cellophane wrapping and a ballerina brand ballpoint pen were found. An empty Colt 45 unrusted 1-pint can was found in the nearby grass. Before the body was recovered, the defendant was arrested on suspicion of murder, and, pursuant to a search warrant, his station wagon was towed to the Sacramento County morgue and searched. 2 Capitol's Palmer brand cigars in cellophane wrappings were on the front seat. Defendant had previously purchased Capitol's Palmer cigars and had 4 or 5 of them in his station wagon on Saturday, August 12, 1967. The police also seized a shirt belonging to the defendant, which shirt the defendant identified as one he had worn on Saturday morning. The shirt pocket was stained with ink. A chemical examination of the ink stain and the ink stain in the ballpoint pen found near Janine's body showed that both inks were of the same type. An autopsy was performed by a physician and surgeon specializing in pathology on Wednesday afternoon, August 16th, about 54 hours after Janine was last seen alive. The body was in a bad state of decomposition. In the physician's opinion, the swelling of the body, the discoloration of the skin, and the distortion of the features were due to degenerative processes occurring after death. The left vulva, an area of the left side of the genitalia outside the body of a female, was more swollen than the right vulva and was discolored differently from the surrounding tissues. These conditions led the pathologist to believe that injury or abrasion had occurred to the left vulva. Because of the decomposition, he was unable to reach a definite medical opinion as to the cause of death, which he estimated to have occurred on the previous Saturday or Sunday. Mrs. Lillian Hayer, who resided on G Street in a southeasterly direction across the Rio Linda High School athletic field from the place where Janine's body was found, testified that sometime between 11:30 and 11:45 a.m. on Saturday, she observed that an old 2-tone station wagon had been driven into the shrubbery around the bank of Dry Creek. The station wagon was identified by Mrs. Hayer as the same one as the station wagon pictured in photographic exhibits of the defendant's car. She marked the place the station wagon had been parked on an enlarged aerial photograph of the scene. This same place was identified by 2 prosecution witnesses as the spot where they discovered Janine's body. Mrs. Hayer's son also observed a light-colored 1954 or 1955 Ford station wagon parked at that point on Dry Creek at approximately noon on Saturday. Mrs. Hayer observed the station wagon leaving the area sometime prior to 1:10 p.m. Saturday, driven by a dark-complected man. Mr. Royden E. Hayer, Lillian Hayer's husband, who operated an airport adjacent to the Hayer residence on G Street, was working in a building at the airport when he heard a shrill cry, like a child's frightened scream, about 11:15 a.m. on Saturday. He went outside to see if he could locate the source of the scream. He looked around but was unable to see anyone and returned to his work. At noon on Saturday, Jeffrey Leacoff was working on a friend's car parked on 10th Street, easterly across the Rio Linda High School athletic field from the point in Dry Creek where the body of the victim was discovered. He observed a Ford station wagon of the same make and model as the defendants parked near Dry Creek, across the athletic field between 12:30 and 1 o'clock Saturday afternoon. He saw the station wagon leave the area, driven by a Negro with a dark complexion. Shortly after 11:15 Saturday night, Janine's mother located the defendant asleep in his station wagon, parked in front of his apartment about 4 or 5 blocks from the Abram residence. She asked the defendant if he knew where Janine was, and he answered, "I left her standing on your front porch." Miss Abram replied, "No, you didn't." Defendant said, "When I left your house, she was standing on your front porch." Miss Abrams told him that her neighbors had seen the defendant leave the Abram residence with Janine, to which he replied, "Well, I'm going to talk to them," and drove off. About 2:10 Sunday morning, Sacramento police officers met Miss Abram in front of the defendant's apartment and asked the defendant if he knew where Janine was. He answered that he didn't know where she was and said she hadn't left with him in his car. He said that the first time he had seen her, she had been standing on the Abram porch. He denied that he had been at the Abrams residence on Saturday morning, said he had visited another house on the same street and had seen Janine playing with the other children around his station wagon, but she had not been in his car that morning. In the presence of the officers, Mrs. Abram began arguing with the defendant, who said he was sorry that anything had happened to the little girl, but that he hadn't seen her. At the trial, the defendant told a different story. He testified that on the Saturday morning in question, he had driven Janine in his 1954 Ford station wagon from the Abram house to the Safeway Market parking lot about 4 or 5 blocks from the Abram residence. Janine was last seen by the defendant, according to his testimony, as she walked toward the front entrance to the Safeway store. He stated that Janine was left at the parking lot, but it never occurred to him that she didn't know her way back home. He denied having any conversation with Mrs. Abram about going to the store to buy soda pop for the Abram children. His testimony was that he agreed to drop Janine off at the store, that nothing was said to him about bringing her home, and that he did not agree to do so. Defendant identified a number of the people's exhibits as photographs of the 1954 Ford station wagon, California license number, owned by him in August 1967. The station wagon is painted in 2 colors. The area above the rain gutter and below the mid-body chrome strip is painted a blue-green color. The area above the mid-body chrome strip and below the rain gutter is painted white. Prior to moving to Sacramento in May 1967, the defendant had lived in Bakersfield after his release from prison, and at the penalty trial, the prosecution introduced evidence of an offense committed there. Felicia Nunn, 13 years of age, testified that on Sunday morning, April 2nd, 1967, when she was home with her brother and sisters while her mother was at work, she saw the defendant, known to her as Willie Curtis, talking with her grandmother who lived across the street. After her grandmother drove away in her car, the defendant started walking away from the house until her grandmother's car turned the corner. He then came back to the Nunn's residence and told Felicia he had left a pocket novel there. She said she didn't know where it was and offered to telephone her mother for the information. Defendant answered, "No, that's all right. I'll call her." He then asked permission to use the bathroom. In the meantime, Felicia prepared her breakfast and took it into her mother's bedroom to watch television. Defendant entered the bedroom and asked Felicia if she was afraid of him. He put his arm around her neck and she started to scream. Defendant displayed a razor blade that he had taken from the bathroom, put his hand over her mouth, and said he would cut her throat unless she became quiet. He attempted to caress her genital area, but Felicia knocked his hand away. Defendant tried to kiss her, saying, "All I want was a little kiss." Felicia's older sister, Dinah, who had been asleep in another bedroom, came in and asked the defendant what he was doing. He answered, "Oh, Dinah, baby." Dinah asked the defendant to leave, and he did so. Felicia telephoned her mother, who immediately left work after asking one of her co-workers to send the police to her home. Later, the defendant telephoned Mrs. Nunn to say he was sorry. Evidence of another prior offense committed by the defendant was also introduced at the penalty trial. Miss Esther Cooper, formerly Miss Grissett, before her marriage, testified that in September 1956 she lived in one unit of a duplex on East Newton Street in Los Angeles. She was then 11 years old and was babysitting with infant children of Mrs. Stewart, whose front door was opposite that of the Grissetts. Defendant knocked on the door of the Stewart unit and asked if anyone was home. Esther opened the door and said, "Miss Stewart isn't here." He forced his way in, walked through the living room and into the kitchen. Esther and the 3-year-old Stewart child followed the defendant, and as Esther entered the kitchen, the defendant placed his arm around her throat. She started screaming and kicking, and the defendant told her, "If you don't be quiet, I'll kill you." Defendant placed his hand over Esther's mouth and held a sharp implement to her throat. Esther's father, Henry Grissett, called to Esther from his unit after he observed the Stewart baby crawl out the front door. Receiving no response, Mr. Grissett ran into the Stewart kitchen, where the defendant loosened his hold on Esther and ran out the back door. Mr. Grissett followed the defendant and later assisted the police in placing him in custody. 4 stitches were required to close Esther's neck wound, which was inflicted by the defendant with a beer can opener. She still carries a scar from the wound. Defendant was convicted and served a term in prison for this offense against Esther. The police report regarding Janine Abram. At approximately midnight on Saturday night, August 12th, Officer Donald Suarez of the Sacramento City Police Department was directed by police car radio to investigate a report of a missing child. He understood this directive to mean that he was to find out where the child had been on Saturday and to find her. He had been informed that she had been with the defendant on Saturday. Officers Swore and Walker interviewed Mrs. Abram, the child's mother, in front of the Abram residence. Accompanied by Mrs. Abram, the officers went to the defendant's residence, but he was not there. They located his parked car on the street, and Mrs. Abram went into nearby bars in search of him. In the meantime, the car had driven away, and the 3 searchers returned to the defendant's residence. Not finding the defendant there, they went back to the Abram residence, where the officers obtained additional information for their written police report. Officer Suarez told Mrs. Abram that the police department would continue searching for her daughter. The officers then reported to police headquarters, and they were going to a nearby restaurant to have lunch. During their lunch, the officers received a phone call from headquarters that the defendant had returned to his residence. Upon arriving there, the officers saw the defendant in front of the residence talking with another unit of police officers who left shortly after the arrival of Officers Suarez and Walker. Mrs. Abram was there and accused the defendant of being responsible for her daughter's disappearance. The defendant asked the officers to keep Mrs. Abram away from him, and the officers told both defendant and Mrs. Abram that their arguing would not help the police in their efforts to locate Janine. Defendant told Officer Suarez that he wanted to be helpful and would assist the police in their investigation. He said he was very sorry about the little girl, but that he had not taken her from her home. He said he had not visited the Abram residence on Saturday morning. He had visited a house several doors away and had seen Janine playing with other children around his car, but he had not been in it. During this conversation with the defendant, Officer Suarez suspected that defendant may have been involved in Janine's disappearance, but he also felt that there was nothing to go on as a ground for taking the defendant into custody because of the conflicting statements by Mrs. Abram that defendant had taken Janine in a station wagon Saturday morning and by defendant's denial that he had done so. The defendant testified that Officer Suarez said to him in substance, "You know, the little girl is missing." Now, at this point, I don't have too much reason to believe that anything really happened. We feel it is just a case where she hasn't come home. You are not under arrest, but there will be additional officers out to talk to you in the next 5 or 6 hours. Please be available or let someone know if you go away from home any length of time. Officer Suarez did not intend to arrest the defendant at that time, did not arrest him, and left him at his home after the conversation ended about 3 a.m. The defendant was arrested later Sunday morning at about 10:30. During the trial, Mr. Miller never apologized to the family for what he had done. Janine's mom fainted after screaming and crying hysterically, "Why? Why? Why, my baby?" The whole room erupted into a barrage of screams and pandemonium. The family had known Miller most of their lives and thought he was just a nice man hanging around and playing with the kids. Others, mostly the men, tried to get to Miller to strike him, but police guards surrounded him and the judge proceeded to call order back into the court. With whimpering and sighs all over the room, it finally settled into a quiet stillness as they helped Janine's mom back into her seat. Mr. Miller destroyed so many lives with his arrest and lack of confession to the crime. Miller had killed her because she could identify him. He had covered her dead body to throw the police off of his trail. A jury found Willie Curtis Miller guilty of first-degree murder and fixed the penalty at death. Another child molester was arrested for the murder and rape of 7-year-old Megan Kanka in a New Jersey suburb. The offender lived directly across the street from the Kanka residence. Yet the police department was prohibited from disclosing the presence of this child molester because at the time the law did not allow the release of sex offender information to the public. The law, dubbed Megan's Law, was changed to permit the release of this information to the public. California's version of Megan's Law went into effect on September 25th, 1996. This law was implemented to allow potential victims to protect themselves and allow parents to protect their children. The law provides police with the ability to notify neighborhoods and residents of the existence of serious offenders and further provides for public access to sex offender information under controlled circumstances. You may access the Megan's Law website at http://www.meganslaw.california.gov. This site provides the name, addresses, description, and offense information of registered sex offenders. The map shows the approximate locations of sexual offenders and can be searched by city, zip code, school, parks, etc. Members of the public may not use the information they obtain by any means in accordance with the law to commit any crime. Criminal misuse of the information subjects the person who misuses it to a sentence enhancement in addition to the punishment for the crime committed. Civil misuse of the information may subject that person to civil damages. Pastor Daniels was a fair man. Annie was ready to leave the Sunshine Band, but had to wait until it was her turn, and she actually came of age. There was only one known exception made for Wayne, Annie's younger brother. Wayne they called the Songbird because he had a beautiful, high-toned voice for a little boy, and he sang Silent Night every Christmas holiday season for years at the request of Pastor Daniels. By the time Wayne turned 10 years old, he was allowed to sing and travel with the youth choir. Annie finally turned 13 and attended her first youth choir rehearsal. She was very happy. Finally, she thought, I'm a big girl now. Within weeks, Wayne followed her into the choir, and she was not happy, especially since she was given the order to take care of and babysit her younger brother by Momma Lydia. During those days, the kids would talk to the pastors. So Annie protested to Pastor Daniels about Wayne not waiting his turn like she did. Pastor Daniels was a light-hearted, friendly man who just chuckled and teased Annie until she gave in to let her brother stay. He really wasn't that much trouble, she thought. Annie was extremely happy also, because she had been moved from the front row into the choir stand behind the pastors and could no longer see Elder Charley unless he turned around. He seemed uncomfortable to turn around because all eyes in the choir would turn on him. Annie chuckled to herself. One day, as Annie sat on her front lawn, she saw a white car that looked a little familiar drive by and parked several houses down. She kept laughing and talking with her friend Alice, but noticed that no one got out of the car, and there was a person's figure sitting in it. At first she thought it was her imagination, but no doubt it looked like Elder Charley's car. Casually, she watched from a corner of her eye, but that person never got out of the car. Suspiciously, she could see quite clearly by then and thought it strange that they kept sitting there for over an hour. Annie was very aware that Elder Charley lived in a different neighborhood from their own, but the hairs on her skin started to creep up and crawl just as it did in church. Annie told Alice that she was going inside. Evening was approaching and she was going to babysit her 2 younger brothers while her mom and dad went to church. Her other family members were already gone. Momma Lydia left Annie with 2 baskets of laundry to fold and have finished before she got home in several hours. Don't open the door for anyone, Momma Lydia said, and they locked the door and left. Annie turned on the television, went into the kitchen to make some popcorn for her and the boys when she heard a hard knock on the door. At first, Annie thought it was the television when the knock came again. She knew her family members would never knock because they all had keys of their own. She even had her own key. Who is it? A man's voice said, "It's me. Open the door." Annie recognized that voice. She was right. He must have been watching and waiting for her parents to leave. They had only been gone for about 10 minutes. She said again, "Who is it?" "It's me, Elder Charley. Open the door. I want to talk to you." Annie made the meanest, sternest face she could muster. She had no plans of opening that door. It was dark outside by now, and Annie flipped on the bright 100-watt porch light in his face. She opened the curtain next to where he stood, and with that fierce face, it startled him when she said, "No, I'll tell my parents you came by to see them." Annie closed the curtain quickly and leaned on the wall, scared he might try something. Annie began to pray, "Lord, don't let him hurt us. Please make him leave." The door was heavy, but Annie knew he could break in if he wanted, since he was such a big man. With a pounding heart, beating rapidly, Annie listened intently. She heard Elder Charley mumble a muffled statement, and he turned and rapidly left the porch. From a different window, Annie peeped until he drove away. Annie phoned the church and asked to speak to her mother. She told everything that had happened. Momma Lydia was a real mother bear, and she told everyone there at the service what had just happened. They agreed that Elder Charley had been observed watching the children. Pastor Daniel's wife specifically had been observing his actions towards Annie. There were lots of whispers. The children did not know what happened, but Annie never saw Elder Charley again. His wife returned to church several times afterwards alone, and then the church heard that she had moved to Los Angeles. Years later, she returned to visit the church, but had remarried and seemed happy. Thursday, September 29, 2011. Daily correction clips by Sam Stanton of the Sacramento Bee newspaper wrote, "Sacramento child killer could get out of prison after 43 years. Willie Curtis Miller has bounced around the California prison system since 1968, when he was packed off to San Quentin's death row for the murder of Janine Abram. Annie often wondered how many little girls Elder Charley had already hurt, and if he had ever been caught and jailed. No one uttered a word or told Annie where or why he had disappeared. But she knew the Sunshine Band members had been saved from a dangerous man.
I take Nurtec with me wherever I go. Ask your doctor about Nurtec today.